In 1896, a European army marched into Africa. Armed, confident, and absolutely certain of victory. They believed Africans couldn't fight back. They were wrong. What happened next didn't just shock Italy, it shook the entire colonial world to its core. You're watching a story most history books buried. A story about a nation that refused to be owned. If you've never heard the name Adwa, stay with us. Because after today, you'll never forget it. Hit subscribe if you believe history should tell the truth. All of it. Now, let's go back to 1895. To understand what happened at Adwa, you first have to understand the world it happened in. By the late 1800s, Europe had turned Africa into a competition. In 1884, the major European powers gathered in Berlin, Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, and sat around a table to divide an entire continent between themselves. No African ruler was invited. No African voice was heard. They called it the Berlin Conference. Africans would later call it exactly what it was: theft with paperwork. Within a decade, nearly 90% of Africa had been claimed by one European nation or another. The British had Egypt and South Africa, and stretches in between. France had massive pieces of West and Central Africa. Belgium had the Congo. Portugal held the coasts. And they all marched into these territories under the same story: that they were bringing civilization to people who didn't have one. But there was one country that refused to accept that story: Ethiopia. Ethiopia was ancient in a way that made European nations look young. It had been a kingdom for over 2,000 years. It had its own written language, JS, its own calendar, its own form of Christianity stretching back to the 4th century. It had trade routes and architecture and literature, while most of Europe was still in the Dark Ages. Ethiopia was not a place without civilization. It was one of the birthplaces of it. And in the early 1890s, Ethiopia had a leader equal to the moment. His name was Menelik II, King of Kings, Emperor of Ethiopia. He was not a man who ruled by ceremony alone. He was sharp, patient, politically skilled, and deeply aware that the walls were closing in around him. He watched how other African kingdoms fell, often because they were unprepared, divided, or betrayed from within. Menelik decided he would be none of those things. Meanwhile, Italy was watching Ethiopia with hungry eyes. Italy was a young country, only unified as a nation in 1861, and deeply anxious about its standing among European powers. Britain had India. France had Indochina. Italy had almost nothing. Empire was seen as proof of greatness, and Italy wanted that proof badly. They had already established a foothold on the coast of the Red Sea in a territory called Eritrea, which sat directly on Ethiopia's northern border. And they believed that Ethiopia would be the next piece to fall. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed what appeared to be a friendship agreement, the Treaty of Wuchale. But buried inside that treaty was a trap. The Italian version of the document contained a clause that stated Ethiopia must conduct all its foreign affairs through Italy. In other words, it secretly converted Ethiopia into an Italian protectorate, a puppet state that could not speak to the rest of the world without Italy's permission. The Amharic version of the same treaty said nothing of the sort. It gave Ethiopia a choice, not a command. When Menelik discovered the deception, he was not panicked, he was clear-eyed. He formally denounced the treaty in 1893 and notified every European government that Ethiopia was, and would remain, fully sovereign. Italy called this a provocation. Menelik called it the truth. The Italian government began preparing for war. They sent General Oreste Baratieri to East Africa to lead the campaign. Baratieri was confident to the point of arrogance. He told politicians in Rome that he would deal with the Ethiopian problem quickly. He reportedly boasted he would bring Menelik back to Italy in a cage. Rome expected a short, decisive war, the kind colonial armies were used to winning in weeks. They had never fought anyone like Menelik. While Italy was writing its boastful speeches, Menelik had already been preparing for this moment for years. He had used his diplomatic relationships carefully, purchasing weapons from France and Russia, importing tens of thousands of modern rifles, and building up a military force that European intelligence had completely underestimated. He had understood, long before the shooting started, that resisting colonialism was not only a matter of courage, it was a matter of preparation. In the final months of 1895, Menelik sent out the nagarit, the imperial war drums. The sound of those drums carried across mountain and valley, reaching every corner of the empire. It was the emperor's call to arms. And Ethiopia answered. Over 100,000 soldiers gathered. Soldiers from every region, every ethnic group, every background that made up the vast mosaic of the Ethiopian Empire. They marched through some of the most rugged terrain on earth, through the highlands, through narrow mountain passes, through cold river valleys, carrying their weapons, their cattle, their supplies. It was one of the largest military mobilizations in African history at that time. And Menelik did not march alone. His wife, Empress Taytu Betul, refused to stay behind. She was not simply a supporting figure. Taytu was fierce, politically brilliant, and deeply respected by the military. She commanded her own contingent of troops, organized supply lines, and rode among the soldiers to keep morale high. She was at Adwa not as a spectator, but as a commander. History has not given her nearly enough credit for what she did. By early 1896, the Ethiopian army was camped in the mountains near the town of Adwa in the Tigray region, waiting. The Italian army, on the other hand, was in trouble. Baratieri had led approximately 17,000 soldiers, a mix of Italian troops and African colonial soldiers from Eritrea, into the highlands. But the campaign was stalling. Supply lines were stretched thin. Soldiers were underfed. The Italian army had been sitting in the mountains for weeks, and morale was crumbling. Back in Rome, the government was growing impatient. The war was supposed to be over by now. Instead, it had gone quiet, and that silence was humiliating. Baratieri held a meeting with his senior officers on the night of February 29, 1896. His commanders argued for an immediate attack. They believed one bold move would break the stalemate and deliver the victory Rome was demanding. Baratieri had doubts, but the political pressure won. He agreed to move. The plan was to march at night, 3 separate columns, each taking a different route through the mountains, and converge near Adwa before dawn. It was a complex maneuver that required precise timing and accurate maps. Unfortunately for Italy, their maps were deeply flawed. The terrain they believed they understood, they did not understand at all. In the darkness of the early morning hours of March 1, 1896, 17,000 soldiers began to move through the mountains. They marched quietly, believing they had the element of surprise. They did not know that Menelik's scouts had been watching them for days. Ethiopia already knew they were coming. Dawn arrived in the mountains around Adwa with cold air and pale light. And then, everything broke apart at once. General Vittorio Albertone, commanding the first column, had marched too far forward. His faulty map had sent him directly into the center of the Ethiopian army. His column was immediately surrounded on all sides by thousands of warriors who had been positioned and waiting. Albertone's force was overwhelmed within the opening hour. He was captured alive. His column was destroyed. General Vittorio da Bormida led the second column into a valley that opened onto an ambush. Ethiopian forces under Ras Mikael poured down from the surrounding ridges from every direction. Da Bormida tried to hold his line. He could not. He was killed in the fighting, and his column collapsed. The third column under General Giuseppe Elena tried to establish a defensive position on a ridge, but was quickly outflanked and driven back. There was no coordinated support from the other columns, because the other columns no longer existed as fighting forces. Menelik watched from a commanding position on high ground. He directed his forces in real time, reading the battle as it moved, sending units where they were needed. He had 100,000 soldiers positioned across the surrounding terrain. The Ethiopians were not fighting blindly. They were executing a plan on ground they knew intimately against an enemy that was fragmented, confused, and now in full panic. The fighting lasted roughly 6 hours. By early afternoon, it was over. More than 6,000 Italian and European soldiers were dead. Another 1,500 were taken prisoner. Entire regiments had ceased to exist. General Baratieri fled the battlefield and never recovered his reputation. The Italian army, one of the European powers that had come to Africa to civilize and control, had been shattered by an African nation fighting to remain free. It was the worst defeat a European colonial army had suffered in Africa ever. The news reached Rome and exploded through the government. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, who had pushed aggressively for the war, resigned in shame. Street protests broke out across Italy, anger, grief, and disbelief. The army that was supposed to win in weeks had been destroyed in hours by Africans with rifles on their own land. Menelik handled the victory with dignity. He treated the Italian prisoners according to the laws of war, provided them with food and basic care, and later released them. It was a deliberate, measured act, the behavior of a statesman, not a warlord. It made Italy's colonial arrogance look even smaller by comparison. In October 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. They officially and completely recognized Ethiopia as a free, independent, and sovereign nation. It was the first time a European colonial power had signed a formal peace treaty acknowledging defeat to an African state. Italy got nothing. Ethiopia kept everything. The impact of Adwa traveled far beyond the mountains of Tigray. Across the African continent and throughout the African diaspora, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, people heard what had happened at Adwa and felt something shift inside them. Here was proof, written in history, that could not be undone or erased, proof that African people could not simply be taken, proof that resistance was possible, that victory was possible. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born Pan-African leader who would inspire millions in the early 20th century, pointed to Ethiopia as proof that African people had a great history worth reclaiming. The Rastafari movement, which emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s, placed Ethiopia at the center of its identity and faith, with Adwa as a foundational symbol of black dignity and resistance. When Italy invaded Ethiopia again in 1935, this time under Mussolini, using poison gas and aerial bombardment to achieve what Baratieri could not, Haile Selassie stood before the League of Nations and appealed to the world. He invoked the spirit of Adwa. The world largely looked away that time, but the memory of 1896 never faded. Every year on March 2nd, the day after the battle, Ethiopians celebrate Adwa Victory Day as a national holiday. The battle is honored in songs, in paintings, in the names of streets and schools. It is not just a military victory, it is a declaration of identity, a reminder that Ethiopia chose itself over surrender. And Empress Taytu Betul, who rode into that battle and commanded real soldiers on a real battlefield, deserves to stand beside Menelik in every account of this story. She was there, she fought, she helped win. History is written by the powerful, until the powerful lose. The Battle of Adwa is proof that courage, preparation, unity, and the refusal to accept someone else's story about who you are can change everything. Italy came to Africa with guns and arrogance. Ethiopia sent them home with neither. Remember that name. Adwa. March 1st, 1896. The day Africa said, "Enough." If this story moved you, share it. Because the people who fought at Adwa deserve to be known by the whole world. Drop a comment below and tell us, which part of the story surprised you the most? Subscribe for more hidden chapters of real history that never made it into your textbooks. The truth is always worth telling. Always.